In this series, between wars, post-war, we've been looking at some of the famous European writers of the first part of the 20th century, who are often grouped into this, I suppose, what is called existentialist movement. I don't know whether they gave it that name themselves or someone else did, but anyway, the name seems to have developed. And we've been looking at Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, and I was going to go on to another one of that group, or it's possibly put into that group, whether of his own volition or not, and that's Franz Kafka. But I just thought before doing that I'd have a bit of an interlude and talk about this guy called Louis Ferdinand Celine, who's not nearly as famous as those others, and even in his own lifetime to some extent he was, but since then is not any longer. And look at some of the reasons why that might be, why he might belong to that group or might not, and why he might be not so celebrated as some of the others, both then and now. So if you look at that, Celine was a Frenchman like Camus and Sartre, so he was a contemporary of theirs. He was of the same period. He was writing books in that same era between the First and Second World Wars and into the time after the Second World War. He was a co-nationalist with them. He was another Frenchman. Kafka, of course, wasn't, but Camus and Sartre were Frenchmen. And his view of the world was somewhat similar to theirs. So when people looked at him and those others, they tended to group them together, rightly or wrongly. Camus continued to be celebrated and much read and highly regarded for a long time after that, but Celine, for reasons connected with the Second World War, was kind of disgraced and became rather, a figure that's more or less disregarded. Anyway, so just to and we'll look more at some of his books later on when we go. I plan to go on to Kafka next week anyway, but I just wanted to make this little bit of an interlude, as I said, about Celine. So when you think of those three French writers, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Louis Ferdinand Celine, I get the impression anyway when I read some of their books, Sartre considered that he was right, and other people considered he was right. People in that world, in that milieu, I suppose if you want to use that term, thought he was the one who knew what he was talking about. He's kind of set the standards, he set the tone, and he more or less laid down the framework of that philosophy. And when you read the semi-autobiographical fictional works, you get that impression from the character that who seems to be representing him in those books, that he knows what's going on, he knows what's right. A lot of the other characters are somewhat misguided, partly enlightened, partly deluded, but don't really know what's happening. But Sartre himself knows, so he's the one that's got the goods on everything, really. Camus seems to understand what's happening and has his own framework of understanding the world, but he's kind of the victim of it himself. So, as we've talked about in earlier episodes, he had this idea that life is meaningless. We cling to life because we don't want to lose it and we don't want to go off into nothingness, but at the same time we believe it is all meaningless, so there's that quandary, really. But some of the characters, like Meursault in Camus' book, what was it called? The Outsider, is almost deliberately invites a condemnation of guilt for murder, and thus condemns himself to be executed, but is in agony over the fact that he's going to lose his life. So there's that character. Camus himself died quite young. He was very successful and celebrated in his lifetime, and had an honourable part in France's involvement in the Second World War, but then he was killed in a car accident fairly early in life. So they seem to be almost sacrificing themselves or being sacrificed in some way, a bit like the Kirillov, who's the Dostoevsky character in the Dostoevsky novel The Devils, whom Camus writes a lot about in his book, The Myth of Sisyphus. We've talked about that before as well. But Kirillov actually deliberately consents to suicide to benefit a revolutionary group. And in doing so, he somehow believes that he is solving the problem of death and saving the whole human race, because he's deliberately choosing death, though he's agonised at the process of going towards death. He believes that somehow he's solving that problem. It seems a bit like that with Camus himself. So he's kind of a sacrifice that's going to save the human race, solve the problem of this absurdity of the meaningless of life and the endlessness of death. So he doesn't actually say this in any of the books, but I sort of get the impression from reading them that he almost sees himself and his characters see themselves as a kind of, if you want to say it, a kind of an atheist Christ, a sort of an antichrist Christ, who by giving up himself to death is going to solve the problem of death for the human race. So I don't know if he even actually conceived that idea in his mind, but the idea sort of comes across anyway to me a bit when reading the books. So Sartre is this all-knowing person who really can't be disputed. He's the boss, he's the philosopher. Camus is the kind of sacrificial lamb. And Celine is very different from that. He's kind of critical of everything, sceptical of everything, sarcastic, and making himself deliberately disagreeable in a way to everybody. And that's what his books are really about. The first of Louis Ferdinand Celine's books that I read, when I was a teenager, made a very big impression on me at the time. I think it was the first one that he actually wrote, was called Journey to the End of the Night, which the title sounds kind of pretentious really, and overly philosophical and heroic, I suppose, and romantic, but it's fairly an apt title for the book. But I just wonder whether he was deliberately being sarcastic and mocking himself when he gave it that title. I'm not sure anyway, but anyway, that was the name of it. But like all the others that he wrote, it's a semi-autobiographical novel again. And again, as with the Sartre ones, I mean, I don't know how much is strictly his story, how much is embellished with other things, how much of it is purely fiction. I mean, one would have to really intensively know the biography of those people to be able to answer that question. But anyway, so Journey to the End of the Night begins with him as a young man enlisting in the French army at the beginning of the First World War, and then soon afterwards he seems to be out of the army. Like, we know that Celine was injured in the First World War, and presumably that put an end to his military career. It doesn't actually explain that in the book, but anyway, some of those events are related in there. So having come out of the army, he then finds himself on a ship bound for the French colonies in Africa. And everywhere he goes, he irritates and annoys the people around him and causes them to be suspicious of him and almost to be angry with him and almost want to kill him. And that seems to be the pattern all the way through the books. So he seems to regard everybody as somehow fallible and cowardly and hypocritical, but he includes himself in that. He knows that he has all those faults as well and doesn't try to hide that fact. So it's a very negative view of human beings and their life and the world. Misanthropic, I suppose you would say. So it follows his adventures through Africa and then to America for a while and then back to France again. And always this kind of jaded view of everything. So then he wrote another book, I think the one after that was called Death on the Instalment Plan, but that actually goes back earlier in his life, in his childhood and his school years in France and in England. So again, I don't know how much of that is actually, how closely that follows his real life. but a similar kind of view of everything, of the world and how things work out, and the injustice and the sort of lack of sensitivity and the coarseness and corruption and all those kind of negative views of things. So I'll have to hurry on a bit now because I want to fit all this just into one episode. But some of the other books that he wrote, there was a set of books one called Wignall's Band and another called London Bridge, which are actually really part of the same story of his adventures in England when he became involved with a kind of a criminal gang in London. And it's quite obvious when you read them that they are part of the same story, and he makes no bones about the fact that he published one part of it early simply because he was short of money and he just needed to get some money from a publisher, so he didn't complete a book, he just rounded it off in a rough sort of a way so that it could be published directly so he could earn some money. Later on he came back and wrote the rest of it. And even in the introduction to it he makes it clear that that's what he's doing. He's sort of always kind of denigrating himself really. And then, but in the Second World War, and this is where his troubles got worse, because he somehow, and it's not really clear how, in the meantime I forgot to say he'd trained as a doctor and worked as a doctor, and that in itself involved him in a lot of experiences on the kind of seamy side of life in Paris and other places, treating the down and out and people who were living miserably and dying miserably in many cases. But anyway, so in the Second World War he somehow got himself involved with the Germans after the occupation of France, I suppose. And that's where he differs from these other famous French writers like Sartre and Camus and Malraux that we'll mention if we have time, who all became involved with the French resistance, and we don't really know how much they did, but some of them, particularly Malraux, played a fairly heroic part there, and they were also intellectuals, they were writers, they were well read by the French public. Their status only increased after the war because of the part they played in that heroic resistance to the Germans. But Celine was on the other side, seemed to be on the other side for some reason, we don't quite know how, and that certainly came against him afterwards. But anyway, so he wrote this book called, there's several books he wrote about that part of his life, but one called Castle to Castle, which again to some extent is presumably a true account of true events, perhaps embellished somewhat by his imagination. But he was working as a doctor for a German military unit that was retreating. The Germans at that stage knew they had lost the war. They were being attacked from the air by the RAF and things that had no protection. They knew the Allied armies were closing in on them, so he just recounts all the characters he knows there. They're all defeated, depressed, but not wanting to admit that. Still having these kind of unrealistic expectations that there might be some final victory that they might achieve. Seeking some sort of sexual release in different ways, and just corruptly gaining favouritism. It's just in some trifling things like how much food they got. So everyone was kind of blaming each other and trying to justify himself and looking desperately for some sort of way out, and knowing that there wasn't any way out.